The history of the parting of the Red Sea to allow the passage of the Israelites and the subsequent destruction of the Egyptian army. We explore the exodus of the Israelites, a journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom, guided by Moses. Through miracles and trials, this account not only highlights their struggle for liberation, but also the formation of a nation united by faith. This video captures the essence of their epic journey towards the promise of a new life. Chapter 1. Oppression in Egypt. In the fertile lands of Egypt, nourished by the generous floods of the Nile, a story of contrasts and contradictions unfolded. The descendants of Jacob, once welcomed as guests of honor thanks to the providence of Joseph, found themselves multiplied in number, becoming a robust community within the Egyptian kingdom. However, this growth, far from being considered a blessing, ignited the flames of insecurity in the heart of the Pharaoh, the supreme ruler of Egypt. Fearing that the Israelites might rise in arms or join external enemies in case of war, he decided to subject them to the cruelest of slaveries. The workdays became endless under the scorching sun, and the whips of the Egyptian taskmasters marked the rhythm of an existence of suffering and hardship for the Israelites. The Pharaoh's orders were relentless: build and raise the storage cities, Pithom and Ramses, as testimonies of an empire that boasted of its greatness at the expense of others' suffering. But his fear of revolt was not appeased, and in an act of desperation and cruelty, he decreed the death of every newborn Israeli male, a measure that sought to cut the future of this people at the root. In this dark panorama, the Israeli families cried out for liberation, their prayers ascending day and night, asking the God of their fathers to remember his covenant and deliver them from oppression. Among them, faith was transmitted in whispers, keeping alive the hope that the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob of their land and a great nation would finally materialize. The oppression in Egypt represented not only the hardest trial for the Israelites, but also the prelude to one of the most extraordinary liberation stories ever told. In this environment of despair, the seed of redemption was about to germinate, marking the beginning of a path towards freedom that would be remembered for generations. The stage was set for a figure capable of leading his people towards a promised destiny, a leader who would be born in the very heart of oppression and raised under the shadow of those who oppressed his people. Chapter 2. The Birth of Moses. In the depths of the Egyptian night, where silence was only interrupted by the soft murmur of the Nile, Moses was born. His arrival into the world was not celebrated with great feasts or announced with trumpets, but in the secrecy of a humble Israeli dwelling, under the menacing shadow of the Pharaonic edict. In those moments, courage took the form of a mother determined to save her son from a cruel fate, hiding him for 3 months and defying the decree that condemned newborn Israelis to be thrown into the river. The Nile River, a source of life and death in this narrative, became the setting for an act of unprecedented faith. Moses' mother, with her heart squeezed by pain and hope, placed her son in a basket of reeds, waterproofed with pitch and tar, and laid it among the reeds at the river's edge. It was a silent plea to God, a gesture of trust that divine providence would guide her son's fate. The current of the Nile carried the basket to where the Pharaoh's daughter bathed, accompanied by her maidens. Upon discovering the child, compassion seized her heart. In a gesture that defied her father's orders, she decided to adopt the child as her own, unknowing that she was welcoming the future liberator of Israel. Thus, Moses grew up in the opulent halls of the Egyptian palace, educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, but his identity and destiny remained veiled, waiting for the moment to be revealed. This twist of fate was not a mere whim of chance. Moses, raised among the Egyptian elite and oblivious to the oppression of his brethren, was a bridge between two worlds. However, his heart began to stir, a sign of the internal struggle he would face upon discovering his true heritage. Despite his privileges, an indescribable connection drew him towards his people, towards the suffering of those who labored under the Egyptian yoke. This self-discovery and realization of his life's mission would become the catalyst for a transcendental change, not only for him, but for an entire nation. Moses' life in the Egyptian court, marked by luxury and learning, was merely the prologue to a story of faith, leadership, and liberation. A path that would lead him to confront his past, his people, and the very God who had chosen him from birth to fulfill a mission far greater than any palace could contain. Chapter 3: The Call of Moses. The midday sun fell mercilessly on the desert sands when Moses, now a man, found himself tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, priest of Midian. Life in exile had been a drastic turn for someone raised in the opulence of Egypt, but it had also been a time of reflection and personal growth. The quietude of the desert contrasted with Moses' internal tumult, who still struggled to understand his purpose and identity. It was in this setting of search and solitude that the event that would change his life and the history of his people forever occurred. While leading the flock across Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, Moses witnessed an astonishing spectacle: a bush burning with fire but not consumed. Curiosity drew him closer, until the voice of God stopped him, calling him by name from the midst of the bush. This sacred moment marked the beginning of his divine mission. God revealed his plan to liberate the Israelites from Egypt and entrusted him with the task of leading this exodus. Despite Moses' doubts and insecurities, the promise of divine presence and guidance strengthened him. This call was not just a divine encounter, but a profound transformation for Moses. He went from being a shepherd in the desert to becoming the instrument of liberation for his people. Through his dialogue with God, Moses experienced a mix of fear, awe, and finally acceptance of his role as leader and prophet. God granted him miraculous signs as proof of his power and authority before the people of Israel and before the Pharaoh. Moses' preparation for his mission was not limited to supernatural power. It also involved a preparation of the heart and spirit. The voice in the burning bush sought not only to liberate the Israelites from physical oppression, but also to invite them into a more profound relationship with God, marking the beginning of a new stage in the history of faith. Returning to Egypt, Moses was equipped not only with God's staff but also with a new understanding of his identity and purpose. The mission entrusted to him carried the weight of history and the promise of redemption, not only for him but for an entire people crying out for freedom. In the figure of Moses, the exile-turned-liberator, the transformative power of faith and obedience to a call that transcends the imaginable is reflected. Chapter 4: The Plagues of Egypt. With resolution forged in the silence of the desert and divine power as his standard, Moses returned to Egypt. By his side, Aaron, his brother, would be his voice and companion in the mission entrusted by God. Together, they stood before the Pharaoh, the hardened heart of the empire, to demand the liberation of the Israelites. "Let my people go," echoed in the vast halls, more than a petition, a divine command. The Pharaoh's refusal was not surprising. It was prophesied in the heart of the mission. Heaven's response to the Pharaoh's obstinacy manifested in 10 plagues, each a strike against the idols and beliefs of Egypt, a challenge to the gods who claimed to hold the land of Egypt under their protection. The first plague turned the waters of the Nile into blood, and the source of life for Egypt turned into death and desolation. But the heart of the Pharaoh remained inflexible, and with each refusal, a new plague was unleashed: frogs emerging in multitudes, lice, flies, the death of livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the Egyptian firstborns. Each plague was a demonstration of God's supreme power over the forces of nature and the Egyptian deities. However, they were also an invitation to repentance, an opportunity for the Pharaoh to yield. But his heart, hardened even more by pride and rebellion, closed off the possibility of liberation without violence. Among the plagues, the lives of the Israelites were transformed. From being passive witnesses to their oppression, they began to see the powerful acts of a God who intervened directly in their history. Each sign and each wonder strengthened their faith and hope in the promise of freedom. Though surrounded by chaos, a light of hope grew in their hearts, fueled by the words and actions of Moses, the man who had returned from his self-imposed exile to confront the most powerful empire on earth. The last plague, the death of the firstborns, represented the breaking point in this divine battle against human obstinacy. That night, pain penetrated every Egyptian home, from the dwelling of the Pharaoh to that of the humblest citizen, leaving a void that no wealth or power could fill. Only in the homes of the Israelites, marked by the blood of the Passover lamb, did death pass over, a sign of imminent salvation and liberation. Thus, the plagues of Egypt were not merely punishments but manifestations of divine judgment and signs of an unbreakable promise, the liberation of a chosen people. In the darkness of Egypt, the light of hope never extinguished. It was strengthened with each act of divine power, guiding the Israelites towards the dawn of their freedom. Chapter 5. The Last Plague and the Exodus from Egypt. The night the last plague was unleashed over Egypt was marked by a foreboding silence, broken only by the sudden outcry that arose from the Egyptian houses. The death of the firstborns, a direct blow to the heart of every Egyptian family and the future of the empire, finally broke the iron will of the Pharaoh. Amid mourning and despair, he ordered Moses and his people to leave Egypt immediately, fearing more disasters if they continued in his land. The Israelites, prepared for this moment by divine instructions, departed from Egypt not as fugitives in the darkness of the night but as a people liberated under the moonlight, carrying not only their belongings but also the riches of Egypt, given by the Egyptians themselves, eager to appease this powerful God who had demonstrated his supremacy in such a devastating manner. The departure from Egypt was not merely a physical act of moving from one place to another. It was the beginning of the fulfillment of a divine promise made generations ago. The Israelites, guided by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, advanced towards freedom, leaving behind centuries of slavery. This exodus marked not only the liberation from physical oppression but also the birth of a nation under divine guidance and protection. However, liberation was not without challenges. The Pharaoh's decision to pursue the Israelites, reversing his mandate of liberation, tested the newly strengthened faith of the people. The approach of the Egyptian army, with chariots and horsemen, threatened to annihilate the dream of freedom even before it could be fully realized. The situation seemed desperate upon reaching the Red Sea. On one side, the impossible waters to cross, and on the other, the relentless advance of their pursuers. At this critical moment, Moses' response to his people was a declaration of faith and trust in God. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation the Lord will bring you today." What followed was a miracle that would be etched in the collective memory of Israel and in the history of world faith. The parting of the Red Sea would not only be a spectacular demonstration of divine power but also the definitive seal of Israel's liberation from Egyptian slavery. The departure from Egypt, marked by the miracle of the Red Sea, was not only the end of an era of oppression but also the beginning of a long journey towards identity and faith. It was the dawn of a new relationship between God and his chosen people, a journey that would take them through the desert, but always under the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey. This exodus, then, becomes the first step towards the realization of an eternal covenant, the foundation upon which Israel's identity and spirituality will be built. Chapter 6. The Passover. On the eve of their liberation, the Israelites received instructions that would mark the beginning of an enduring tradition, the Passover. This rite, laden with symbolism and meaning, was instituted as an eternal memorial of the night God passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, saving them from the plague that took the Egyptian firstborns. They were ordered to sacrifice an unblemished lamb at twilight, smear its blood on the lintels and doorposts of their houses, and consume the meat roasted over fire that same night, accompanied by unleavened bread and bitter herbs. This act of faith had multiple layers of meaning. The blood on the doors served as a sign for the destroying angel to pass over those houses, thus protecting the inhabitants within. It was, at the same time, an act of obedience and trust in God's word, as well as a prophetic symbol of the Lamb of God who would be sacrificed for the redemption of mankind in the future. The haste with which they had to eat the lamb, dressed for travel, with their sandals on and their staff in hand, reflected the urgency and imminence of their departure. There was no time to waste. After centuries of waiting, the promise of liberation was about to be fulfilled. The Passover would become the most sacred feast in the Jewish calendar, an annual celebration of liberation from slavery, of God's salvific power, and of Israel's unique identity as a people chosen by God. The Passover night in Egypt was the last act of an era of oppression and the prelude to a new life of freedom. It not only signified divine protection over the Israelites in a moment of great danger but also taught them profound lessons about redemption, sanctification, and dependence on God. By observing the Passover, each generation of Israelites would relive the experience of their ancestors, reaffirming their faith in God and their commitment to the covenant that had made them a nation. This foundational event in the history of Israel consolidated their collective identity and offered them a framework through which to understand their relationship with God and with the world. The Passover symbolized the victory of light over darkness, of life over death, and would serve as a source of hope and faith in the most challenging moments they would face on their journey to the Promised Land and throughout their history. In the celebration of Passover, the Israelites not only remembered what God had done for them but also anticipated what God would continue to do in their favor, keeping alive the promise of redemption and liberation. Chapter 7. The Pursuit by the Pharaoh. Just as the Israelites had taken their first steps towards freedom, the Pharaoh's heart was once again seized by hardness and regret. The loss of his slave labor force and the blow to his pride and power led the Pharaoh to question his decision. "What have we done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" he lamented, immersed in a mix of anger and despair. Driven by these feelings, he decided to pursue the Israelites with the aim of recapturing them or annihilating them, a decision that would seal his fate and that of his army. The Egyptian war machine was quickly set in motion. War chariots, horsemen, and soldiers, the most powerful forces of the ancient world, launched in pursuit of an unarmed people burdened with the sorrows and hopes of generations. The news of the Egyptian advance reached the Israelites when they were vulnerable, camped in front of the Red Sea. Fear took hold of them, and they were faced with the imminence of a disaster that seemed to erase all hope of freedom. Accusations against Moses did not wait. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you took us out to die in the desert?" However, Moses' faith remained firm in the face of collective panic. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation the Lord will bring you today," were his words, a beacon of hope amidst despair. The Pharaoh's pursuit was not just a mortal threat, but also the final test before the consummation of their freedom. At this critical point, the Israelites were forced to confront not only their pursuers but also their fears and doubts, a confrontation that would define their identity and faith forever. Divine intervention was about to manifest in an even more astonishing and definitive manner. The parting of the Red Sea would be the setting for one of the greatest demonstrations of God's saving power, an event that would mark not only the end of the Pharaoh's pursuit but also the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between God and his chosen people. In this tense wait, with the enemy at their doorstep and the sea blocking their escape, the Israelites were about to witness a miracle that would become the centerpiece of their faith and narrative as a people, the confirmation that no power on earth could prevail against the divine promise of liberation and protection. Chapter 8. The Parting of the Red Sea. The imposing wall of water on both sides of the Red Sea, a dry corridor stretching before the Israelites, represented the tangible manifestation of divine power and the promise of salvation. Moses, following divine instruction, stretched out his hand over the sea. The night was filled with a strong east wind, and the waters parted, defying all logic and nature. This miraculous act not only marked the path towards the definitive freedom of Israel but also symbolized the passage from slavery to redemption, a collective baptism on the threshold of their birth as a nation under the protection of Yahweh. The crossing through the seabed, with walls of water as silent witnesses to their passage, was an act of unbreakable faith. Behind them lay centuries of oppression. Ahead was the promise of a new life. The march through the Red Sea became a sacred procession, with each step an affirmation of trust in divine promises and each breath an unspoken song of hope and determination. Meanwhile, the Egyptian army, in its arrogance and desperation, entered the miraculously opened path between the waters. The pursuit turned into tragedy when, upon reaching the other shore, Moses again stretched out his hand over the sea, and the waters closed with the same promptness with which they had parted. Chariots, horses, and soldiers were engulfed by the sea, in a definitive demonstration that divine purpose could not be frustrated by human will. This event not only marked the physical liberation of the Israelites from their Egyptian captors but also redefined their collective identity. They were no longer simply a group of escaped slaves. They were the chosen people of God, witnesses and beneficiaries of His salvific acts. The parting of the Red Sea became an enduring symbol of divine intervention in human history, a sign of God's ongoing presence among His people, guiding and protecting them against all adversity. The destruction of the Egyptian army in the waters of the Red Sea closed a long and painful chapter in the history of Israel, but also opened another, full of challenges and promises. The journey through the desert to the Promised Land would be arduous, marked by trials and revelations, but the experience of the Red Sea would serve as a constant reminder that, even in the darkest moments, the light of divine providence would never abandon them. This miracle, inscribed in the collective memory of Israel, would be recounted from generation to generation, an eternal testimony of their identity as a people liberated by the mighty hand of God. Chapter 9. The Destruction of the Egyptian Army. The dawn that followed the crossing of the Red Sea was unlike any other. The Israelites, now on the other side, looked back towards the calming waters, silent witnesses to an unprecedented miracle. The destruction of the Egyptian army, once the most feared force in the ancient world, now lay buried under the waves, symbolizing not only the physical liberation from slavery but also the definitive break with a past of oppression. The divine victory over the Pharaoh and his armies was a powerful affirmation of God's care and protection for His chosen people. This moment of triumph, however, was also a time of deep reflection for the Israelites. The magnitude of divine power, capable of altering the laws of nature for their salvation, infused them with a renewed sense of purpose and destiny. They realized that their liberation was not just the result of their longing for freedom but part of a much larger divine plan, calling them to be bearers of a mission and a promise. The news of the Egyptian army's destruction spread quickly among the surrounding nations, instilling a reverent fear of the Israelites and their God. This act not only secured their safe passage through the desert but also set the stage for the future conquests that awaited them on their way to the Promised Land. Israel's perception changed radically. They were no longer considered mere escaped slaves but as a people under the direct and powerful protection of Yahweh. For Moses, the destruction of the Egyptian army reaffirmed his calling and leadership. Despite the doubts and challenges he faced, his faith and obedience were dramatically vindicated. This event solidified his position as the undisputed leader of Israel, anointed by divine will to guide his people towards their destiny. The trust between Moses and the Israelites was strengthened, uniting leader and people in a common cause and shared faith. The victory over Egypt and the miracle of the Red Sea became central points of Israeli identity, perpetual reminders of their liberation and of God's faithfulness to His promises. These events were inscribed in the collective memory and liturgy of Israel, celebrated in festivities, and transmitted from generation to generation as testimonies of their history and faith. In this act of salvation, the Israelites found not only freedom but also a call to live as a chosen people, committed to justice, mercy, and the worship of the one true God, whose wondrous works had been manifested so powerfully and definitively. Chapter 10. The Song of Moses and Miriam. With the dawn's glow reflecting on the tranquil waters returning to their natural state, the Israelites gathered on the other shore of the Red Sea. The air vibrated with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. Currently, in jubilation and reflection, Moses, the leader whom God had used as an instrument of liberation, initiated a song. This song was not just an expression of joy for physical salvation but also an acknowledgement of God's power, holiness, and sovereignty over all things. The words of Moses' song resonated among the crowd, rising as a hymn of victory and faith. "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea," began the song, recalling God's powerful intervention against the Egyptian army. This hymn celebrated not only the victory over oppressors but also affirmed trust in God as their guide and protector on the way to the promise. Miriam, Moses' sister, took a tambourine in her hands, and all the women followed her with tambourines and dancing. Miriam, a prophetess and leader among women, responded to Moses' song with her own, reiterating the proclamation of divine victory. "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." This collective response from the women not only emphasized the active role of the entire community in celebrating faith and gratitude towards God but also highlighted Miriam's importance as a spiritual leader and her role in the narrative of liberation. The Song of Moses and Miriam marked the beginning of a new stage in the relationship between God and the Israelites. Through these expressions of praise and worship, the people reaffirmed their commitment to the Lord, recognizing their total dependence on His guidance and protection. This moment of collective worship also served as a reminder that their liberation was not the end of their journey but the beginning of a renewed covenant, a pact that would require fidelity, obedience, and trust on the way to the promised land. The song became an enduring testimony to God's intervention in the history of Israel, a hymn that would be transmitted through generations as a symbol of faith and hope. In moments of doubt and challenge, the memory of this song would remind the Israelite people of God's faithfulness to His promises, urging them to keep their faith alive and walk in obedience to His will. This episode of worship and celebration on the shores of the Red Sea encapsulates the essence of the relationship between God and His chosen people, a story of salvation, faith, and eternal commitment.